The instructor said, "Use what you have." She made a weapon out of her test. The floor was shaking under my knees, and the machine was already turning its head toward me before I had time to think about running. I was on my back in the sand pit of the training dome, called the Hollow, my kit spread open beside me, and the drone was closing the distance faster than the manual said it should. My name is Laura Whitfield, and 30 seconds earlier I had been standing calm at the edge of the arena floor, listening to Instructor Vec Thal give her final instruction before the door sealed shut behind me. Now there was nothing calm left in me at all. Vec Thal was not human. She belonged to a species called the Drawn, tall and gray-skinned, with a voice that clicked faintly between words no matter what language she spoke. She had trained hundreds of cadets before me, from a dozen different worlds, and she always said the same thing before a trial began. Use what you have. I had heard those words so many times that morning that they had stopped meaning anything to me. Now, with a machine built to knock a grown soldier flat bearing down on me, they meant everything. The kit in front of me held nothing that looked like a weapon. A stylus for writing on data slates. A small scanner meant to read a person's pulse and breathing during stress. 3 sealed vials of clear fluid used to calibrate the scanner before a test began. A roll of medical adhesive strips. That was the entire kit. No blade, no blaster, no shield. Just the sort of ordinary equipment you would find in a school nurse's office. And a war machine coming at me across open sand. The drone's targeting lights blinked from amber to red, and every cadet who had gone through this trial before me had told the same story afterward. When the lights turn red, you have about 4 seconds before it reaches striking range. I did not spend those 4 seconds running for the fake rock formations at the edge of the dome, the way the other cadets in my class had already done, ducking behind cover the moment the door sealed. I spent them looking at the 3 vials in my hand and reading the small printed warning on the side of the label, the kind of label nobody reads until their life depends on it. Flammable above a certain temperature, not much above room temperature either. Somebody in a supply office 3-star systems away had written those words years ago, never imagining that a cadet from Earth would read them in the middle of a combat trial and smile. The drone reached striking range exactly on schedule. I rolled sideways through the sand, felt the wind of its arm pass close enough to lift the hair on the back of my neck, and came up already working. The stylus had a metal tip built to carry a small electrical charge when it touched a data slate. I twisted it loose from its casing with my thumb, jammed the bare tip into the socket where the scanner's little sensor lens usually sat, and felt the whole assembly grow warm in my hand almost at once. That was step 1. Step 2 was the fluid. I cracked the first vial open against the stylus and felt a spark jump between the metal tip and the wet plastic casing, a spark small enough that under any other circumstances nobody would have noticed it at all. But calibration fluid does not need a large spark. It needs the right kind. The little flame that caught along the vial's broken edge was no bigger than a candle, and I flung it low and flat, the way you would skip a stone across a pond, straight at the sensor cluster on the front of the drone's head. The machine did something I had not expected. It flinched. Not a large flinch. Not the kind of thing a person watching from the observation windows above the dome would even notice unless they knew exactly what to look for. But its optics stuttered, correcting for the sudden burst of heat across its front lens, and for 2 full seconds it stopped tracking me the way it should have. 2 seconds is not very long. It felt like an hour. I used it to do the thing every training manual on every world would have told me not to do. Instead of putting distance between myself and the drone, I closed the gap. I went in low, under the swing of its main arm, close enough to smell hot metal and ozone, and pressed the second vial directly against the vent where its cooling system pulled in air. The fluid was thick and clung to the metal instead of running off, and within seconds the drone's internal fans were screaming at a pitch that made my back teeth hurt. A war machine that is overheating does not think clearly, if you can call what a machine does thinking at all. Its threat priorities scrambled. Its arm, which had been tracking my chest a moment before, swung wide and slow, correcting for a body that had already moved somewhere else. I felt the wind of it pass my shoulder, close enough to tear a strip from my sleeve, but not close enough to do any real harm. The observation windows above the dome had gone quiet. I could feel it even though I could not see the faces up there, the particular kind of silence that happens when a room full of people stop breathing at the same moment. I still had one vial left, and I still had the stylus, still faintly warm and sparking at the tip where the wire had shorted against the broken plastic. The drone's arm was seizing up now, the joint at its shoulder grinding against itself as the heat and the fluid fought the servos trying to move it. I pressed the last of the calibration fluid straight into that joint and touched the sparking tip of the stylus against the wet metal the same way you would touch a match to dry paper. It was not fire this time. It was something the drone systems clearly had never been designed to handle, a joint that suddenly refused to move at all, locked at an angle that made the whole arm useless, drawing power it did not have the cooling capacity to spend. The buzzer sounded 9 minutes into a 40-minute trial. Not because the time had run out, because the machine chasing me had nothing left to give. I sat back in the sand, breathing hard, one shoulder aching where I had rolled too fast across the ground, and looked up at the drone standing silent and smoking a few paces away. Its head was still turned toward me, lights dark now, arm frozen at an angle that would have looked almost comical if it had not been trying to knock me flat a minute earlier. The dome door slid open sooner than I expected, and Instructor Vekthal walked in across the sand with a pace that was neither fast nor slow, simply steady, the way she did everything. She stopped a few feet from the drone and studied it for a long moment before she looked at me. I expected her to be angry. Every version of this moment I had imagined on the walk to the dome that morning ended with some kind of reprimand, a lecture about the difference between a diagnostic kit and a weapon, maybe a mark against my record for damaging Academy property. Instead, she crouched down beside the ruined vials scattered in the sand, picked one up, turned it over once in 3 long fingers, and set it down again without a word. Behind her, through the open door, I could see the other cadets from my class gathered at the edge of the dome, and every one of them was staring at me the way you would stare at something you had never seen before and were not entirely sure was safe. 2 of the drawn cadets were whispering to each other. One of the Osseti, a species with pale blue skin and no visible ears, had both of his hands pressed flat against his own chest in a gesture I did not recognize but that looked, from where I sat, uncomfortably close to alarm. Vekthal finally spoke. Her voice was as flat and clicking as ever, but there was something underneath it I had not heard from her before, in 3 months of training under her. That was not the correct method, she said. Every cadet who has taken this trial in 11 cycles has understood my instruction to mean one thing. Use your mind, use your training, use your endurance to outlast the machine until the timer ends. You are the first who understood it to mean something else entirely. I did not know what to say to that, so I said the only honest thing I had. It worked, though. She looked at me for a long moment, and something moved behind her dark, unreadable eyes that I could not name at the time, but would understand much better before the week was over. Yes, she said finally, it worked, and that is precisely the problem. She did not explain what she meant by that. She simply straightened, turned, and walked back out of the dome, leaving me sitting in the sand next to a smoking machine and a kit, with nothing left inside it but an empty stylus casing and a roll of adhesive strips I had never even needed. It would be hours before I understood that her words in that moment were not a judgment on what I had done. They were a warning about what was coming next. I did not know it yet, standing in the wreckage of that trial with sand in my boots and my heart still hammering against my ribs. But somewhere above us, in a section of the station no cadet was ever supposed to see, 3 ships that did not belong to the Academy had already begun their final approach. And in less than 2 hours, the difference between a training drone and a real threat would stop being theoretical. The debrief room was small and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after an alarm rather than before one. I sat across the table from Vekthal while she filled out a report on a data slate, and I tried not to stare at the scorch marks still visible on my sleeve. My friend Daniel Ashford was waiting outside when I finally came out, leaning against the corridor wall with his arms crossed and a look on his face somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "You set your test kit on fire," he said. Not a question. He had already heard. "I did not set it on fire," I said. "I used it correctly." Daniel laughed, the kind of laugh that came easy to him even after a bad day, and fell into step beside me as we walked toward the mess hall. He had been in the academy 2 cycles longer than me, transferred from a different training station on the other side of Earth's territory, and he had a habit of treating every disaster as something to be examined later over food. "Grace Sutton is going to want the full story," he said. "She missed the observation window. Something about a maintenance shift. Grace was the 3rd human cadet in our class, and if Daniel treated disaster as something to be discussed calmly, Grace treated it as something to be outperformed. She had transferred in from a combat engineering track, sharp-tongued and quick to point out when someone else's plan had a flaw in it, and for the first 2 months of training, the 3 of us had circled each other more like rivals than friends. That had changed slowly, the way these things do, somewhere between long nights studying alien tactics manuals and the particular kind of trust that grows when you are the only 3 people from your homeworld inside a station full of species who still were not entirely sure what to make of you. We found her in the mess hall already sitting at our usual table, and before I could say a single word, she slid a tray across to me and said, "Tell me everything," in a tone that made it clear this was not a request. I was halfway through explaining the calibration fluid when the alarm went off. It was not the alarm I expected. Every cadet at the academy had been drilled on the standard alert tones within the first week of arrival. There was a tone for a hull breach, a tone for a fire, a tone for a drill, each one distinct enough that you learn to recognize them the way you recognize a familiar voice. The sound that filled the mess hall was none of those. It was a long, low note that dropped in pitch every few seconds, and around us every alien cadet in the room went suddenly, completely still. Daniel was the first of us to notice the reaction on the other tables. "What is that?" he asked, but nobody answered him, because in the same moment the lights along the ceiling shifted from their normal white to a deep, pulsing red, and a voice came over the station comm system that I had never heard before, calm and mechanical, and utterly without warmth. "Unauthorized vessels detected at docking ring 7. All personnel proceed to designated shelter zones. This is not a drill." Grace was on her feet before the message finished playing. Around us, the mess hall had turned into a slow-moving crowd, cadets and instructors alike moving toward the exits with the kind of forced calm that people use when they are trying very hard not to panic in front of each other. I grabbed my kit bag from under the table, empty as it was. Out of some instinct I did not stop to examine, and followed Daniel and Grace toward the nearest corridor. The Academy's shelter protocol sent cadets toward the lower decks, away from the docking rings, but the corridor outside the mess hall was already crowded enough that our group had barely made it 20 meters before the flow of bodies slowed to a stop. Somewhere ahead of us, past a bend in the corridor I could not see around, someone screamed. It was not the kind of scream that comes from surprise. It was the kind that comes from real fear, and it cut through the low murmur of the crowd like a blade. The crowd around us broke apart all at once, cadets scattering in different directions, and through the gap I finally saw what had caused it. 3 figures had come around the corridor bend from the direction of the docking ring, tall and armored in a matte gray plating I did not recognize from any species catalog I had studied. They moved with a coordinated, practiced ease that told me immediately these were not confused refugees or lost maintenance workers. They were here on purpose, and they were looking for something. Or someone. Grace grabbed my arm and pulled me sideways into a side corridor before I had fully processed what I was looking at, Daniel close behind us, and we pressed ourselves flat against the wall as the sound of the crowd's panic rose and fell down the main hallway. Through the narrow gap of the side corridor's entrance, I could still see part of the main hall, and I watched one of the armored figures raise something that was not a weapon exactly, not in the way I understood the word, but a device that fired a wide net of pale blue light across a cluster of fleeing cadets. Every one of them caught in that net dropped where they stood, not harmed exactly, but completely and suddenly unable to move. "They are taking people," Daniel whispered, and his voice had lost every trace of the calm humor from 10 minutes earlier. "Not hurting them, taking them." I did not know why that thought was somehow worse than the alternative, but it was. Grace was already moving, pulling us deeper into the side corridor away from the main hall, toward a maintenance access point I recognized from a tour we had taken during our first week at the academy. "This leads down to the lower mechanical deck," she said. "If we can get below the main levels, we can circle around to the shelter zones without crossing their path." The maintenance hatch was sealed, of course, requiring a code none of us had, and for a moment the three of us simply stood staring at the small keypad beside it, while the sound of the crowd and the strange weapons grew louder behind us. It was Daniel who finally spoke the thought that had already occurred to me. "Laura," he said, "your kit." I looked down at the empty gray case still hanging from my shoulder and understood immediately what he meant. The kit was empty now, every useful part of it burned or broken in the training dome an hour earlier, but the case itself still had one thing left inside it that none of us had thought to use before: a small magnetic clasp meant to keep the case shut during transport, strong enough to hold the weight of a full diagnostic kit against a moving body without slipping loose. It was not a lockpick, it was not designed to be one, but the maintenance hatch's keypad cover was held on by 4 small screws, and the edge of the clasp, forced flat and worked carefully into the gap at the corner of the panel, was just narrow enough and just strong enough to pry the cover away from the wall. Behind the cover was exactly what I had hoped to find: a simple manual override switch meant for emergency use by maintenance crews who did not have time to enter a code. I threw it, and the hatch slid open with a hiss of stale, recycled air. We dropped through into the lower mechanical deck just as the sound of raised voices reached the mouth of the side corridor behind us, and Grace pulled the hatch shut and jammed the clasp into the track above it, wedging it closed as tightly as 3 cadets working with their bare hands could manage. The lower deck was dim, lit only by strips of pale emergency lighting along the floor, and the air smelled of hot metal and coolant, the kind of smell that told you machinery was working hard somewhere nearby. Daniel found a maintenance map on a wall panel near the hatch and traced a route with one finger, while Grace kept watch on the hatch above us, listening for any sign that the armored figures had found the maintenance access point. "If we follow this corridor to the junction here," Daniel said quietly, "we come out near the shelter zone on deck 4. It adds 15 minutes to the walk, but we avoid the main corridors entirely. 15 minutes felt like a very long time with unknown attackers somewhere above us, but it was better than walking straight into the net weapons we had already seen in action." We moved as quietly as we could through the dim corridor, past humming coolant pipes and the low mechanical breathing of the station's life support systems, and for a while it seemed like Daniel's route would work exactly as planned. Then the lights ahead of us went out. Not the emergency strips along the floor, which continued their faint pale glow, but the working lights further down the corridor, the ones that marked the junction Daniel had pointed to on the map. One by one they died, section by section, in a pattern too deliberate to be a malfunction. Someone was cutting power ahead of us, on purpose, section by section, and they were doing it in the exact direction we needed to walk. Grace's hand found my arm in the dark, her grip tight enough to hurt. "They know this deck," she whispered. "They know where the access points lead." Which meant whatever these armored strangers were, and whatever they had come to the academy to find, they were not improvising the way I had been forced to improvise in the training dome an hour earlier. They had a plan, and it had already accounted for cadets like us, trying to find a quiet way around them. I thought of Vekthal's words in the debrief room, the strange weight in her voice, when she said that what I had done in the trial was precisely the problem, and for the first time since the alarm sounded, I began to wonder if the two events happening within an hour of each other was not a coincidence at all. The dark corridor ahead of us was not silent for long. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from somewhere past the junction where the lights had died, and Daniel pulled us both back against the nearest wall without a word, pressing a finger to his lips, even though none of us had spoken above a whisper in several minutes. Two shapes moved into the pale emergency light at the far end of the corridor, armored the same matte gray as the figures we had seen in the main hall, and this time I could make out more detail. They were not human, though their build was close enough that in poor light you might have mistaken them for a person in heavy armor. Their helmets curved back at an angle that suggested a skull shape unlike anything in the species catalog I had studied, and the device one of them carried, the same pale blue net weapon from before, hung loose in one hand as they walked, almost casual, like they expected no resistance at all. They stopped at the junction, close enough now that I could hear them speaking, a language none of us recognized, clipped and low. One of them gestured back the way they had come, and the other nodded, and after a moment they turned and moved off down a side passage, their footsteps fading into the hum of the coolant pipes. Grace let out a breath she had clearly been holding since the lights went dark. "That is not the way to the shelter zone," she whispered. "That is the way to the reactor access corridor." "Why would raiders want the reactor?" I asked, though even as I said it I already suspected the answer would not be simple. Daniel had gone very still beside us, staring down the dark passage where the two figures had disappeared. "It is not the reactor they want," he said slowly. "It is what is stored next to it. The Academy keeps a research vault down there, prototype equipment, things the instructors do not let cadets anywhere near." "I did not know that," I said. "Neither did I," Grace admitted. "Until last month. I got lost during a maintenance drill and ended up down there by accident. There was a whole section sealed behind clearance doors I had never seen before, and an instructor practically dragged me back out before I got a good look." We did not have time to debate the meaning of any of this. The junction ahead was dark and empty now, and if we wanted to reach the shelter zone on Deck 4, or find any working comm terminal to warn someone about what we had seen, we needed to move while the corridor was clear. We had gone perhaps 30 meters past the junction when the deck beneath our feet shuddered, a deep vibration that traveled up through the metal floor plates and rattled the coolant pipes along the ceiling. Somewhere far above us, muffled by several decks of hull and machinery, came the unmistakable sound of an explosion, distant enough that it did not throw us off our feet, but close enough that dust drifted down from a seam in the ceiling panels above. "They are forcing the vault," Daniel said, and this time there was no humor left in his voice at all. "Whatever they came here for, they are done being quiet about it." The station comm system crackled to life around us, the same calm mechanical voice from before, but this time carrying an edge of urgency that had not been present in the first announcement. "All personnel remain in shelter positions. Security forces are responding to a breach on Deck 2. Do not attempt to move through affected corridors. This is not a drill." "We are already past Deck 2, Grace said. "Whatever is happening up there, we cannot go back the way we came." Which left us with exactly one option, and none of us particularly liked it. The maintenance corridor we stood in ran directly past the reactor access point, close enough to the research vault that if the raiders had already breached it, we would walk straight into whatever was happening there. But behind us, the way back was blocked by whatever had caused that explosion, and ahead of us, past the vault, the corridor eventually connected to the shelter zone on Deck 4, exactly the destination we had been trying to reach the entire time. "There is no way around it," Daniel said finally. "We go through, or we go back into that crowd upstairs and hope for the best." Nobody argued for going back. We moved forward as quietly as three frightened cadets could manage, past humming pipes and dim emergency lighting, until the corridor opened into a wider chamber that I recognized immediately, despite never having seen it before, as the reactor access point Grace had described. A heavy blast door stood at the far end, twisted open at one corner where something had clearly forced it, and beyond it I could see the warm orange glow of the reactor's containment field, and, closer to us, three more of the armored figures moving equipment out of a smaller side vault, whose door had been cut open with tools that left the edges glowing faint red in the dim light. They were not looking for cadets to capture anymore, or if they were, that was not their priority now. Crates of equipment, sealed in matte black cases stamped with symbols I did not recognize, were being carried out through the twisted blast door two at a time, loaded onto a small floating cargo sled that hovered silently a few feet off the ground. We pressed ourselves into the shadow of a support column at the edge of the chamber, and it was Grace who first noticed the shape half hidden behind a stack of crates near the vault entrance. A person, human, dressed in the plain gray coveralls of Academy maintenance staff, sitting slumped against the wall with hands bound in front of them by a strip of the same pale blue light the net weapons produced. "That is Mr. Pratt," Grace whispered. "He runs the reactor deck maintenance crew. I have seen him in the mess hall a dozen times. He was awake, his eyes open and alert despite the restraints, and when his gaze found us in the shadow of the column, he gave the smallest possible shake of his head, a clear warning to stay back and stay hidden." But one of the armored figures near the vault entrance was already turning, some instinct or sensor drawing its attention toward the far side of the chamber where we crouched. There was no time to retreat back the way we had come. The corridor behind us was long and straight, and if that figure had already noticed something out of place, running would only draw its full attention faster than staying still ever could. I looked down at the empty kit bag still hanging from my shoulder, and for one terrible moment, I thought there was truly nothing left inside it to use. The stylus was gone, spent in the training dome. The vials were empty, the adhesive strips remained, and the magnetic clasp we had already used once to force open the maintenance hatch, and beyond that, nothing. But the chamber around us was not empty. It was a maintenance and cargo space, full of the kind of ordinary equipment that nobody ever thinks to look at twice until they desperately need it. A rack of empty coolant canisters stood against the near wall, each one fitted with a pressure release valve designed to vent built-up gas safely if a canister overheated. A spool of thick industrial cable sat coiled beside a workbench a few feet away, the kind used to secure heavy cargo during transport, and bolted to the column we crouched behind was a fire suppression unit, its nozzle pointed out into the open chamber, connected by a line of pressurized tubing that ran up into the ceiling. I did not have a plan so much as I had a series of half-formed instincts, the same instincts that had gotten me through the training dome an hour earlier, and there was no time left to turn them into anything more careful than that. I reached up, twisted the release valve on the fire suppression line as far as it would go, and felt the tubing shudder under my hand as pressure began to build. The armored figure that had turned toward our column took 2 more steps in our direction, its weapon rising, and I did the only thing left to do. I yanked the nozzle free from its mounting bracket and pointed it straight at the figure's helmet, releasing the full built-up pressure of the suppression line in a single blast of chemical foam that struck it square across the faceplate, hard enough to knock it back a full step, its vision suddenly and completely obscured. "Go," Daniel hissed, and the 3 of us broke from cover, sprinting low across the open chamber floor toward the bound figure of the maintenance worker slumped against the wall. Grace reached him first, working at the pale blue restraint around his wrists with the edge of the magnetic clasp from my kit bag, the same trick that had forced open the maintenance hatch earlier, proving just as effective against whatever material the restraint was made from. It gave way after a few seconds of steady pressure, and the maintenance worker, George Pratt, pulled himself upright with a groan, one hand pressed against a bruise darkening along his jaw. "They came through the vent shaft behind the vault," he said, his voice rough. "Cut through before anyone even knew they were aboard. There are more of them down here than you think, and they are not raiders looking for easy loot. They know exactly what they came for." "What did they come for?" I asked, though some part of me had already begun to guess at an answer I did not want to hear. Pratt's eyes flicked toward the twisted blast door, toward the crates still being loaded onto the hovering cargo sled, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped low enough that I had to lean in to hear him over the hum of the reactor nearby. "Prototype defense systems," he said. Built from Academy research on cadet performance data. Someone out there wants to know exactly how humans keep solving problems your equipment was never designed to solve, and they think the fastest way to learn is to take the equipment and the data straight from the source. Behind us, the armored figure I had blinded with foam was already wiping its faceplate clear, its weapon rising again, and this time there was no cover close enough to reach before it found its aim. Pratt moved faster than I expected for a man who had spent the last several minutes bound and slumped against a wall. He grabbed the spool of industrial cable from the workbench beside us and shoved it into my hands without explanation, then pointed toward a control panel mounted on the near side of the reactor's containment housing, half hidden behind a support strut. "That panel controls the maintenance crane," he said. "It is rated to lift 6 tons. If you can reach it and throw the manual override, the crane arm will swing across this entire chamber on its own track. Nothing in its path is walking away from that without noticing." Grace was already moving toward the panel before he finished speaking, sliding low along the base of the containment housing while Daniel and I did the only thing we could to buy her the time she needed. I looped one end of the industrial cable around the base of the support column we had been hiding behind, and Daniel understood what I intended without needing to be told, taking the other end and running it low across the open chamber floor toward a second column near the twisted blast door, keeping it slack and hidden against the shadowed floor plates. The armored figure with the foam still dripping from its faceplate took 3 long strides toward us, weapon raised, and caught its boot on the cable at exactly the height and moment we needed. It went down hard, its weapon discharging harmlessly into the ceiling in a wide arc of pale blue light that dissipated against the metal panels above, without effect. That was the opening Grace needed. The maintenance crane control panel came alive under her hands with a low mechanical whir, and somewhere above us, a massive articulated arm, built for lifting reactor components far heavier than any person, began swinging along its overhead track with a groan of old but well-maintained machinery. It was not a weapon. It had never been designed as one. But 6 tons of moving industrial arm, sweeping across a chamber full of raiders, scrambling to load stolen crates onto a hovering cargo sled, did not need to be a weapon to change the entire shape of the fight. 2 more of the armored figures near the vault entrance dove aside as the crane arm passed low over their heads, scattering the neat stack of crates they had been organizing, several of them crashing open across the floor and spilling their contents in tangled coils of unfamiliar circuitry and dark, matte black casings that looked nothing like anything I had studied in my equipment classes. Pratt was shouting something about a comm terminal near the vault entrance, one that might still be functional despite the damage to the blast door, and Daniel broke off toward it at a dead run while Grace kept the crane control panel cycling, forcing the raiders to keep dodging its slow, relentless sweep across the chamber. I stayed low near the fallen figure still tangled in my cable, and it was only then, close enough to see the details of its armor plating for the first time, that I noticed the symbol stamped across its shoulder, a jagged circle divided into 4 unequal parts, a design I did not recognize but would come to know very well before the day was over. The comm terminal near the vault entrance sparked and hissed as Daniel worked at its damaged casing, and for a long moment I thought it was too badly wrecked to be of any use at all. Then his voice rose over the chaos of the chamber, sharp with something between relief and disbelief. "It is still connected to the station network," he shouted. "I can reach the shelter zone frequency." He did not wait for permission. His voice, breathless and urgent, carried out across every open channel in the shelter zone broadcast, warning whoever was listening that the reactor deck vault had been breached, that raiders were loading stolen prototype equipment onto a cargo sled, and that they were preparing to move it toward what he guessed, correctly as it turned out, was an escape route through the lower cargo bay. The response came faster than any of us expected. Less than a minute later, the chamber's overhead lighting shifted from dim emergency red to full brightness, and a new voice, human, sharp with command authority, cut through the station comm system. "This is Colonel Peter Dawson. All Academy security teams converge on reactor deck access point immediately. Cadets in that chamber, if you can hear this, hold your position and stay low. Help is on its way. I recognized the name immediately. Colonel Dawson oversaw the entire human cadet program, a man I had spoken to perhaps twice since arriving at the Academy, both times briefly and both times in his office rather than anywhere close to an active emergency. Hearing his voice now, calm and certain even as chaos filled the chamber around us, did something to steady my own racing heartbeat in a way I had not expected. The raiders clearly heard the broadcast too, or at least understood enough of the sudden shift in the situation to know their timeline had just been cut short. The three figures still upright near the vault entrance abandoned the scattered crates entirely, gathering only what remained loaded on the hovering cargo sled, and began falling back toward a side passage I had not noticed before, one that likely led down toward the lower cargo bay Daniel had guessed at. Pratt grabbed my arm before I could think about following them. "Let them go," he said. "The prototype equipment matters, but not as much as getting everyone in this chamber out alive. Security teams will handle the pursuit. Our job right now is to make sure nobody else gets hurt." He was right, and some part of me knew it even through the adrenaline still hammering through my chest, but Grace had other ideas. She had abandoned the crane control panel now that its purpose was served, and was crouched beside one of the scattered crates, examining its spilled contents with the same focused intensity she brought to every engineering problem in our classes. "This is not just stolen equipment," she called out. "Look at this circuitry. It is built around cadet performance logs. Our performance logs, specifically. There are files here with names on them. Yours, Laura, mine. A dozen others from our class." That stopped me cold. Whatever these raiders wanted, whatever the symbol on their shoulder plating represented, they had not come to the Academy on a random raid for valuable equipment. They had come specifically for data about human cadets, about the training trials, about the exact kind of improvised problem-solving I had used against the drone in the hollow only an hour before the alarm first sounded. Someone out there already knew what I had done in that trial, before I had even finished doing it. The thought was still settling into place when the side passage the raiders had retreated through erupted with the sound of a much larger confrontation. Shouted commands in two different languages, the sharp crack of something that was not the pale blue net weapon, but a real defensive charge fired by Academy security forces finally arriving in force. Daniel pulled both Grace and me back behind the containment housing as the fight spilled briefly into the edge of our chamber. Three armored raiders retreating under fire from a squad of station security in dark blue plating. Colonel Dawson himself visible at the rear of the group, directing the pursuit with sharp, economical gestures. It was over within minutes. The raiders who had not already escaped down the side passage toward the cargo bay were pinned down and disarmed, their net weapons and remaining equipment confiscated, and the hovering cargo sled, still loaded with several crates of stolen prototype gear, was secured before it could reach whatever escape route the raiders had originally planned. But the sled that mattered most, the one carrying the bulk of the data files and the specialized circuitry Grace had found, along with two of the raiders and their leader, had already vanished down the side passage toward the cargo bay before security forces arrived in the chamber, and Colonel Dawson's expression, when he finally crossed the room to where the three of us stood, catching our breath beside the containment housing, told me everything I needed to know about how serious that loss truly was. "You three," he said, looking between Daniel, Grace, and me with an expression I could not quite read, "report to my office the moment this deck is fully secured. And Cadet Whitfield." "Yes, sir," I said, still breathing hard. "I heard what happened in the training dome this morning," he said, "and I am beginning to understand why whoever planned this raid was in such a hurry to move before word of it spread any further than this station." He did not explain what he meant by that before turning away to direct the security team still securing the chamber, and I was left standing amid the wreckage of scattered crates and abandoned equipment, cable still looped loosely around my hand, trying to piece together exactly how a training trial I had passed only 2 hours earlier had somehow become the reason a group of armed strangers had come looking for me by name. Colonel Dawson's office was smaller than I expected for a man who commanded the entire human cadet program. A narrow room with a single wide window looking out over the curve of the station's outer ring. Stars turning slowly beyond the glass as the Academy continued its steady orbit despite everything that had just happened 3 decks below. He was standing at that window when Daniel, Grace, and I were shown in, and he did not turn around immediately, letting the silence stretch long enough that I began to wonder if we had done something wrong after all. Instructor Vec Thal was already seated near the far wall, hands folded in her lap, watching the 3 of us with the same unreadable expression she had worn in the training dome hours earlier. Her presence in the room told me this was not simply a matter of procedure. Whatever had happened on the reactor deck connected directly back to the trial I had passed that morning, and she was here because she already understood the connection better than any of us. "Sit," Dawson said finally, turning from the window. "The 3 of you did more today than most trained security officers manage in a full career, and I intend to make sure that is recorded properly. But first I owe you an explanation, and I suspect Instructor Vec Thal owes you one as well." He activated a display embedded in the surface of his desk, and an image appeared above it, the same jagged 4-part circle I had seen stamped on the Raider's shoulder plating in the reactor chamber. "A private security contractor," he explained, "operating outside Academy jurisdiction, hired by interest we have not yet fully identified, though we have strong suspicions. For the past several cycles, various parties across Allied space have shown increasing interest in why human cadets consistently solve tactical problems in ways no other species trains for. Today's raid was not random, it was timed." "Timed to what?" Grace asked, though I suspected she, like me, had already begun to guess the answer. "To your trial, Cadet Whitfield," Dawson said, looking directly at me now. "Instructor Vec Thal filed her incident report the moment your trial ended this morning, flagged for review by Academy Command due to the unconventional method you used. Standard procedure. That report should have taken days to move through the proper channels before anyone outside this station saw it. Instead, less than 2 hours after it was filed, an armed raid targeting this station's research vault and cadet performance data arrived at our docking ring. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Someone read the report the moment it was filed," I said slowly. "Someone who was already watching for exactly that kind of report to appear." "Precisely," Vec Thal said, speaking for the first time since we had entered the room. "I have suspected for some time that certain factions outside this academy take a particular interest in the differences between human training results and the results of every other species we instruct. Today confirmed that suspicion far more directly than I would have preferred." Dawson brought up a second image on his desk display, a wireframe schematic of the station's lower decks, a single point near the cargo bay marked in flashing red. The raiders who escaped with the bulk of the stolen data boarded an unregistered shuttle currently holding position at an auxiliary docking clamp on the outer ring, he said. "They have not yet been able to disengage and depart, because the clamp's release mechanism requires a manual authorization code from station control, one our security teams have refused to provide. But that shuttle is armed, lightly, and if they grow desperate enough, they may attempt to force a release rather than wait for one." "Why are you telling us this?" Daniel asked. "Surely this is a matter for your security teams now." "It is," Dawson agreed. "But security teams cannot reach that auxiliary clamp without passing through a service corridor currently flooded with a coolant leak from damage sustained during the initial breach, a leak that will take engineering crews the better part of an hour to seal safely. An hour we may not have, if that shuttle grows impatient. There is, however, one other way to reach the auxiliary clamp control room, a narrow maintenance crawl space too small for anyone in full security armor to use effectively." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. I understood immediately what he was asking, even if he seemed reluctant to say it outright to 3 cadets barely 2 hours removed from their first real crisis. "You want us to go," I said. "I want to ask if you are willing," he corrected. "Nothing more than that. What you have already done today goes well beyond what any cadet should be asked to risk." I will not order you into that crawl space. But if that shuttle escapes with the data it is carrying, every human cadet who trains at this academy from this point forward will be a target for whoever hired those raiders. Because the one thing that data proves beyond any doubt is that human ingenuity under pressure is worth stealing. Grace was the first to answer, and she did not hesitate. I am in, she said. Whatever plan you have for stopping that shuttle, I want to be part of it. Daniel looked at me before he answered, some silent question passing between us that we had shared often enough over the past 2 cycles that neither of us needed words to understand it. Then he nodded, once, and turned back to Dawson. Same here, he said. I thought of the training dome, of Vekthal's words about her instruction meaning something different when I heard it than it had meant to every cadet before me. I thought of the empty kit still hanging from my shoulder, and the strange, sharp confidence I had felt in that dome, not because I believed the odds were in my favor, but because I had learned, somewhere along the way, that the odds mattered less than the willingness to look at what was actually in front of you and ask what it could become. Count me in as well, I said. Vekthal rose from her seat near the wall, and for the first time since I had met her, months earlier, I saw something that might genuinely have been called approval cross her features. Then I am coming with you, she said. Colonel Dawson, if you will authorize it. I have some experience with maintenance crawl spaces from my own training cycles, several decades before any of these 3 cadets were born, and I suspect my presence may prove useful before this is finished. Dawson studied her for a long moment, then nodded, already keying instructions into his desk display. Authorized, he said. Move quickly. I will keep the auxiliary docking clamp locked as long as possible, but I cannot promise how long that will hold if they decide to force the issue. The maintenance crawl space was exactly as narrow as Dawson had described, a tight metal tube running along the outer curve of the station's hull, lit only by the faint glow of small status lights spaced every few meters along its length. Vekthal led the way, moving with a practiced ease that told me she had spent considerable time in spaces like this, long before any of us had arrived at the academy, and the 4 of us made our way forward in near silence. The low hum of the station's outer systems, the only sound besides our own careful breathing. We emerged into the auxiliary clamp control room perhaps 20 minutes later, a small circular chamber, dominated by a single control console and a wide viewport looking out at the docked shuttle beyond, its hull a dull, unmarked gray, running lights blinking in a pattern that suggested its crew was growing increasingly agitated by the delay. The control room was not empty. A single raider, left behind to monitor the clamp release console, turned toward us the moment the maintenance hatch slid open, weapon already rising, and for a fraction of a second, the entire situation balanced on a knife edge that could have gone very badly for all 4 of us. Vekthal moved first, faster than I would have believed possible for someone of her apparent age, closing the distance and driving the raider's weapon arm wide with a single controlled motion before it could discharge. Grace was right behind her, and between the 2 of them the raider was disarmed and restrained within seconds, the fight ending almost before it had properly begun. But the console behind them told a story none of us liked. A countdown had already begun on the display, a manual release sequence initiated moments before our arrival, ticking down from 90 seconds toward a clamp disengagement that would let the shuttle break free regardless of Dawson's authorization lockout. Can you stop it? I asked, already crossing to the console. Not through the normal interface, Daniel said, scanning the display with a frown. They have bypassed the standard authorization system entirely. This is a hard override, routed directly to the clamp's physical release mechanism. The only way to stop it now is to reach the mechanism itself and disable it manually before the countdown finishes. The physical release mechanism, according to the schematic on the console, sat inside a narrow access panel on the far wall of the control room, protected by a simple mechanical lock that would normally require a maintenance key none of us carried. 53 seconds remained on the countdown. I did not have a key. I had, once again, an empty kit bag, A length of leftover industrial cable still looped over one shoulder from the reactor deck, and the same magnetic clasp that had already forced open one locked hatch that day. It was not elegant. It rarely is, when you are working against a countdown with borrowed tools and no time to be careful. I forced the clasp into the gap at the edge of the access panel, exactly the way I had forced it against the maintenance hatch hours earlier, felt it catch against the simple mechanical latch inside, and threw my weight against it until the panel gave way with a sharp crack of breaking plastic. Inside, the physical release mechanism was a simple lever assembly, connected by a cable to the clamp itself, and beside it a small manual safety pin, meant to be inserted by maintenance crews before performing repairs, exactly the kind of safety feature nobody thinks to remove during a hostile override because nobody expects a cadet to know it exists at all. 22 seconds remained on the countdown when I found the safety pin housing empty, the pin itself missing entirely, likely removed by the raiders during their initial access to prevent exactly the interference I was now attempting. But the housing itself, a simple metal slot designed to hold a pin no thicker than a pencil, did not care what object filled it, only that something did. I pulled the stylus casing free from my kit bag, the same empty plastic shell that had held the sparking metal tip in the training dome that morning, and forced it into the safety pin housing with seconds to spare. It was not a perfect fit. It did not need to be. The lever assembly, blocked from completing its final motion by even an imperfect obstruction, ground to a halt with a shudder that traveled up through the access panel and into my hands. On the console behind me, the countdown froze at 4 seconds remaining, the clamp release mechanism locked in place, and through the wide viewport the docked shuttle's running lights flickered in what I could only interpret, even without understanding the vessel's design, as some kind of alarm at its own failed departure. Security teams reached the auxiliary docking ring less than 5 minutes later, moving through a service corridor that had, as it turned out, finished draining its coolant leak far faster than originally estimated once engineering crews learned exactly how urgent the situation had become. The shuttle's crew, trapped and unable to disengage, surrendered without further incident, and the data they had been carrying, along with the majority of the stolen prototype equipment from the reactor deck vault, was recovered intact before the day was finished. I did not learn the full details of who had hired the raid until several days later, when Colonel Dawson called the three of us back to his office, this time with considerably less urgency in his manner. The security contractor responsible, it turned out, had been working under contract for a coalition of private military interests scattered across 3 different star systems, none of them formally hostile toward the Academy or its allied worlds, but all of them deeply interested in understanding exactly why human cadets kept producing tactical results that defied every existing model of combat training. The data recovered from the shuttle, combined with testimony from the captured raiders, gave Academy Command enough evidence to formally protest the raid through diplomatic channels, though Dawson admitted with obvious frustration that it was unlikely anyone involved would ever face meaningful consequence for what had happened. What matters more, he told us, is that we now understand the scope of the interest surrounding your training results. That interest is not going away. If anything, after today, it will likely grow. The Academy intends to review its data security protocols significantly as a result, and I suspect training methods for human cadets specifically will see some changes as well. Does that mean no more trials like the one I went through? I asked. Dawson exchanged a glance with Vecthal, who had been standing quietly near the office door throughout the debrief, and something like a smile crossed his face, brief and tired but genuine. Quite the opposite, he said. Instructor Vecthal has already submitted a proposal to expand that exact trial format across the entire human cadet program. Apparently she believes it produces results worth studying carefully, regardless of who else might be interested in the outcome. Vecthal inclined her head slightly when I looked toward her, and for the first time since I had met her, months earlier, standing rigid and nervous at the edge of the training dome on my very first day at the Academy, her flat, clicking voice carried something that sounded, unmistakably, like pride. "Use what you have," she said. It remains the correct instruction, Cadet Whitfield. I simply did not anticipate how far that instruction could be taken, until you showed me. I do not expect to make that mistake again, with any cadet under my instruction, from any species at all. I thought about those words often in the weeks that followed, through the long process of updated security briefings and the slow, careful rebuilding of the reactor deck vault, through the quiet moments when Daniel, Grace, and I sat together in the mess hall and found we no longer needed to fill every silence with conversation, because some understandings do not require words at all. The Academy changed after that day, in small ways and large ones, new protocols and new caution woven carefully into old routines. But the trial itself never changed, not in its essential shape. Cadets still walked into that gray dome with nothing but an ordinary kit and an instructor's simple instruction waiting for them on the other side of a sealed door. Use what you have. I had learned, the hard way, in the space of a single impossible day, that the instruction was never really about the kit at all. It was about everything else, every ordinary object and unremarkable tool scattered through an entire station full of them, waiting for someone willing to look past what a thing was built to do, and ask instead what it could still become, if the moment demanded it. That, more than any weapon I had ever trained with, turned out to be the only tool I truly needed.